following a lull in violent protests that ripped through the country a few weeks ago, we now take a look at a new report on the state of the Malawian economy. Joining us now on the report's author is Melissa Arjunan, who's an Africa analyst at Rand Merchant Bank. Thanks so much for your time, Melissa. Okay, we're talking about a lull in protests, but certainly it's not the end of them. Malawians really frustrated by the leadership of Bingu wa Mutharika, by the cost of living, by rising inflation. How do you read the political temperature there?
I think it certainly has deteriorated over the past few weeks. Yes, protests have been postponed, but it's important to note that they haven't been cancelled. So it is a possibility that we could see fresh protest action over the short to medium term. Some of the things that protesters are demanding are things like the president declaring his personal wealth, a resolution to the fuel and foreign exchange reserve shortages in the country, and I think most importantly they want a smoothing of the relations between Malawi and the UK, because the UK is the biggest bilateral donor to the country. So I think that is probably one of the biggest demands that they have.
Obviously the UK has withdrawn budget support and other multilateral donors are said to be considering to do the same. That's at least 40% of the administration's budget. How are they coping?
Well, coping is actually a questionable word to use, but yes, we have seen the UK pulling out subsequent to the violent protests in July. We've seen the US pulling out, and the IMF has stalled their negotiations on their ECF program with Malawi as well. So I think because of all of that, we've definitely seen the fuel shortages as well as the foreign exchange reserve shortages. So I don't think that they are managing very well at this stage, and they do need that donor aid going forward.
Now, compounding problems are things like rising inflation. What bearing has that had?
Well, the rising inflation, most of the pressures come from the non-food component, which went up by about 12.2% year on year during the last month. This non-food component has been experiencing rising pressure because of the fuel and foreign exchange reserve shortages and the secondary effects that it's been having. As well, Malawi did devalue its kwacha, so that will also put pressure on inflation over the short term. Things that are helping inflation, though, are the abundant maize supplies and worse than previously estimated economic growth forecasts. So that should help to lessen the demand side pressures of it. But I think because of the liquidity shortages, you'd probably see a strong inflation rate for this year.
It would help if economic output supported the state of the economy at the moment, but we've seen poor tobacco sales. What has that meant for the trade deficit and the deterioration also in the trading conditions? Well,
the trade deficit for the first half of this year deteriorated quite significantly year on year. The value of your imports was almost double the value of your exports. Their imports include things like fuel, fertilizer, and medical imports. And on the export side, you have tobacco, you have uranium, and you have sugar, being the big ones. Tobacco earnings, rightly so, went down, mainly due to a lower tobacco price, as well as a poor quality of the leaf itself. Uranium only contributes about 15% towards export revenue, which is not nearly enough to support the external balances. As well, the devaluing of the kwacha does give Malawi an export competitive advantage, but as well it does increase the price at which they import. So that's a negative for them. But I think overall the lower transfer payments in conjunction with the high trade deficit would ensure that external balances are in quite high deficits for the year.
All right. In the interim, the president has dissolved the cabinet. What's he trying to accomplish there? Well,
no proper formal reason was given for it, but that was actually one of the demands of the protesters, a trimming of the cabinet in an attempt to actually curb government spending. Yeah. So that could actually be seen in a positive light if he is taking the grievances of the protesters seriously. So I think that is probably one of the positives that have come out of it. But I think one could also assume that he would keep those closest and most loyal to him in cabinet as well until he serves his full term until 2014.
I mean, I think also Malawians who are on the lower end of the spectrum have relied heavily on government subsidies and pro-poor schemes, and that's where a lot of the donors had come through. How many of those safety nets have fallen through, thus making the agitation that much more severe? Well,
you have 80% of your population living in rural areas. So the agitation hasn't come through in those sort of areas as yet. It's predominantly in the cities, Blantyre, Lilongwe. So which is actually quite the minority of the population. And even though the protests were postponed last week, you still had predominantly all of your shops closed because people were in fear that there would be violence again, like they were in July. So that is the current situation.
Okay, going forward, the sort of political concerns that will be raised by all sides?
I think one of the biggest things is in terms of succession. There isn't a clear contender to go up in 2014, and I think as there would be a lot of people who are jockeying for that post, and if there are other social and political tensions, this will definitely add upward pressure to it.
Many people looking at the situation would be surprised. Malawi, this was last year one of the fastest growing economies in the world. In fact, I think the statistics said the second fastest growing country after Qatar, arguably from a low base, but people had celebrated the economic program of Bingu wa Mutharika. What's since gone wrong?
I think in Malawi there has been a political spin-off that's led to a downturn on the economic side. You know, Britain pulled out its aid predominantly because it was shown as criticizing the president's autocratic rule, which the president didn't take too kindly, and he hence forecasted a zero deficit budget, which is extremely, I mean, it's not viable. So that basically it is political tensions that have led to an economic downturn.